ADHD girls are not being identified in school. What I struggle with as an adult is if I risk telling someone I've got ADHD, I know I'm not what they think about ADHD because they don't know about female ADHD. And in fact, do they know about ADHD in great detail anyway? Even as an adult, I find that quite difficult. So I'm wondering, what is that like for children? We just need to teach the teachers. Tolerance to difference is what's going to make a big difference to neurodivergent kids.
Jessie Hewitson is an award-winning journalist.
An author writing the book, How to Raise a Happy ADHD Child.
Diagnosed with ADHD herself and raising ADHD children.
She's well-versed in all things neurodiversity.
And on a quest to help you live a happy life.
The bigger the difference in who you really are and who you're coming across as at school, the bigger your problem really as a parent and the bigger mental health problems. If there is a situation with your child and something's happening which is an undesirable outcome, the problem isn't your child, the problem is the problem. I think it's really important to show your child you're on their team. And if there is a problem with school, it's you and them figuring it out. It's not you in school on the same side and your child on the other side.
I suppose on one hand, you don't want the child to feel different, but at the same time, you have to almost communicate that there is a difference there, and that's why there is this difficulty.
Yeah.
What's the tipping point?
I mean, I'm just pro telling a child.
Loyal listeners and viewers, I can't thank you enough for tuning in. If you've ever felt broken or different, I hope this helps in your search for answers and community. And do you know what would really help me in return? By clicking the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. It might not seem like much, but at ADHD Chatter, it means a huge deal. And with this, I can book more incredible guests and keep the self-discovery fire alive for all of us, myself included. Just one click of a button goes really far. And remember, you have always been enough. What's your mission in terms of neurodiversity?
Yeah, so my last 10 years have been spent researching how to help neurodivergent people be happier. And I've done that, in writing 2 books. So the first one 8 years ago was How to Raise a Happy Autistic Child. And now I've written How to Raise a Happy ADHD Child. And the context for that is, I'm sure we both believe this, but there's a crisis of unhappiness among ADHD adults and autistic adults. And my belief is this needs to be treated almost like an emergency, and that we also need to focus on this issue. And what I'm trying to bring is kind of like specific detail, I think, to the conversation of what are the barriers, what is going so wrong with neurodivergent young people and adults, and what can we do about it? The mental health outcomes, as we both know, are very poor if you are a minority brain type. So, and I think the research hasn't always done a very good job in trying to work out why that is.
The 2 books you mentioned, How to Raise a Happy ADHD Child and How to Raise a Happy Autistic Child.
Yeah.
Congratulations, by the way, for writing 2 books.
Thank
huge
you.
achievement. The 2 different neurodiverse diagnoses, one in each title of your 2 books. But as a starting point, are there any common threads between the 2 or just blanket truths on how to raise a healthy neurodiverse child?
Yeah, there are overlaps, and actually more than I realised, when I started writing the ADHD book. So I think if I'm honest, when I wrote the book on autism, my son I thought was autistic. Now I realise he's both, so is my youngest son is both. And I looked at my autistic son, who was, he's now 14, but he was in a mainstream primary school. It wasn't easy for him. And I looked at him and thought, in a way compared to him, I looked at some of the ADHD kids and thought, oh, I don't think they have it so bad, really. My autistic son was very much on the periphery socially. And, I could see these quite outgoing ADHD kids like barreling around, and they looked confident on the surface or like they had friends, But writing this book made me realize that actually there are exactly the same challenges. It's just all of our knowledge about ADHD is so surface level. And, so once I started looking under the bonnet of what was going on, those confident kids, weren't so confident, and the social inclusion that I thought I saw could at times be a bit of a mirage, really. But to talk about the sort of unifying features, I think, sensory overwhelm is one. I think social differences is another, sort of difficulty with neurotypicals in a social context, definitely. Executive function difficulties, I think that peaks with ADHDers, but autistic people struggle with that as well. And I think the big area of overlap is hyperfocus. So we associate hyperfocus with ADHD people, but there's a theory that's very popular in the autistic community of monotropism. And what I found really interesting about this book was, monotropism as a theory is that autistic people like to dedicate a lot of their attention into a small number of things. So if you're monotropic, you just want to sort of crawl into your attention tunnel, be left alone and come out when you're good and ready. And if you're polytropic, let's say if you're neurotypical, you can have back and forth conversations that's less stressful. You can talk about whether you want a tea at work. You can go off and make the tea and come back to your task. Now, for a monotrope, you can't do that without it being quite stressful. And so, I'd always looked at this theory as a key foundation, for the autistic experience. And then writing this book, people were saying to me, this is also a key thing for ADHD people as well. And so I realized that the truth in that, really. And also, when you look at monotropism, and if you think about it as a unifying experience, a fundamental unifying experience for two brain types that can be so different in some ways, that it makes sense. Because, I was always thinking ADHD and autism on the surface can look so different. How can it be that so many of us are both of those two things? Monotropism is one of the unifying experiences.
With monotropism, I had a guest on called Dr. Karam Sadiq who didn't like the term obsession. And he said when someone who perhaps has autistic traits is just so into one or a couple of things, and all of their effort goes into one or a couple of things, he labeled it as a preoccupation. And when you find your thing that you are so into, that's when you can become world-beating and world-class at that thing. But often it's outsiders who label you as weird. Like, why are you so obsessed with that thing? But if you find your thing, then it's magical what can happen if you're allowed to just keep going and working towards that thing. But I suppose as a parent of a neurodivergent child, like, how can you tell if your child has found their preoccupation, and how many different directions should you put your child in order to give them the sort of maximum chance of being able to find it?
Yeah. I mean, just on the first point, I'm neurodivergent myself, so I'm a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD adult. And for me, obsession feels the more accurate term. I mean, I totally get where he's coming from. It does sound like a very pathologized term for what is an immense source of joy, isn't it? And talent for us. But to me, it does feel obsessive because it grips me. It takes hold of my life. And
yes, I'm the same with this podcast. You can wake up first thing, go to bed, last thing I think about. And I think you have to have that level of obsession to get to the level where it's not normal progress. Yeah.
And you achieve things quickly, which you have on your podcast. And, I wrote my autism book in 3 months, and I think it was because I was in the grip of this obsession, constantly hyperfocusing, and I was having a whale of a time, really. And to me, that's preoccupation doesn't really kind of explain that kind of urgent desire to get to know everything about it quite in the same way. But with children, I think, I don't know if there is a perfect term for it at the moment: special interest, intense interest, preoccupations, obsessions. But I think they're a really good source of happiness. And I think really, I like to think of them as a kind of neurodivergent mindfulness, really. So my kids would find it impossible to do a meditation app. But I think, allowing them to indulge themselves as much as they want in whatever is obsessing them, for me, has much of the same sort of purpose. But I don't know. I mean, I think really a child tends to choose for themselves what they're going to obsess over. You might want it to be French literature of the 14th century. They're bound to choose Minecraft or Roblox. So I think generally people find their own thing that's going to consume them. But I guess you can sort of nudge people if you want. But I think generally it's just to see it as a wholly positive thing on someone's life. It gets more complicated when it's on a screen, I know.
If you're a child and you find your obsession and you're pulled out of that, as an adult, we call it sort of mid-hyperfocus interruption rage. But as a child, if they're interrupted from their obsession, what would that look like? Could that be like a tantrum?
Yeah, I think so. I think it'd be described as tantrum/meltdown. And I think you're absolutely right. I think, I had an experience once where I was watching this film and I was so gripped by it. And my husband was so gripped by it. And my very lovely sister just came in, not realising how gripped we were, and just like stopped the film because she wanted to talk to us about something.
Oh, how did that end up?
We still talk about it like 10 years later. So I think I think that's what we're doing to kids, really. It's really not easy. So I think basically trying to avoid that, but also if you're getting a big sort of emotion after you do that, there's a reasonable explanation for it. It is hard.
I would feel dreadful if I knew my child had found their obsession and say it was painting Warhammer or musical theatre or dancing, and I had to send them off to school every morning and knowing that they would have to be sat in a classroom doing maths or history, something that I knew was miles away from their obsession.
Yeah.
But they have to do it. Like, how do you deal with that as a parent? Do you communicate that with the child? Do you have a conversation with the school?
Well, I guess if your child, it depends on how they're accessing their learning because, for ADHD kids who are struggling to access their learning because they don't have a regular supply of dopamine to keep them focused on things, involving their interests is a very successful tool for the teacher or teaching assistant to re-engage them with their learning. So I guess it depends on the arrangement you have with your school and what type of school your child's in. But you can sort of speak to the school about trying to incorporate interest into learning, which is a really brilliant idea to do with ADHD learners. And I think, you can try and level with your child, I think. I personally, with my own children, find an honest approach is best. Like, yes, you want to do Minecraft 14 hours a day. You hate it that you can't. But this is how school is. In a way, how can, we help you to live with it? Okay, you can go crazy on a Saturday.
So interesting. I'm not a parent yet. We were joking before we started. I have a dog, which is obviously not comparable. But I certainly struggle with the consistency in order to train my dog to do things that might be of better behavior for a dog. But I'm worried about the future if I do become a parent. And I suppose my question is, do you think is it harder to be a parent of a neurodivergent child than it is perhaps a neurotypical child?
Yeah. Yes, I think it is. I think the majority of the reason why that is not to do with the child. It's to do with the world. So you are likely to have a lot more sort of negotiation and interaction with the school. You may be involved in what can be intensely stressful negotiations with the local authority, depending on how much support your child needs. I think just on a basic level, trying to get a child with executive function difficulties ready for school. I've got two. It leaves me almost wanting to emit a primal scream by the end of the mornings. It is not easy. And also I think what can be difficult is, your child is not getting a very easy deal here. School, work, healthcare, when they get older, banking. Nothing is set up for your child. And not only is it not set up for it, it's causing them, either a moderate amount of stress or an extreme amount of stress. So you're there watching someone you love intensely, often having a tough time and not understood. And, that's hard. And I think also we pour so much love and energy and trying to help our kids. and you don't always have a happy child as an outcome. It's not always the most realistic outcome. And so I think that can be difficult as a parent, because it's kind of almost like failure is part of the process. And so I think, feeling confident as a parent can be a struggle when you've got a child who isn't, blissfully happy all the time.
And with those struggles that you mentioned, like the school, the banking aren't set up for neurodivergent children to be comfortable and have an easy experience with. At what stage do you communicate that with the child? Because I suppose on one hand, you don't want the child to feel different, but at the same time, you have to almost communicate that there is a difference there, and that's why there is this difficulty.
Yeah.
What's the tipping point?
I'm just pro telling a child about having a different brain type straight away. As soon as you think they may. In our, when my youngest was born, he grew up in a household where we just talked about autism, ADHD every day anyway. And actually, one day, I remember at breakfast, he said, am I ADHD? We said, no, you aren't, because he was so different to his brother. He burst into tears because he wanted to be. And I remember just loving that we'd conveyed so successfully that, being neurotypical wasn't always the ideal outcome, that he was sobbing because he was ADHD. It turned out he was ADHD. We'd given him a duff steer. But I think I love labels. My family's gathered them all really in the neurodiversity space. I think, and I know some people do worry about talking about their child's difference, but I see it as vital information. And I do think if you don't tell your child that they are different and why they're different, then that child will come up with the label themselves, and it will be far worse, than the ADHD one.
A quick word from our sponsors to address a big ADHD issue, the notebook fallacy. We all convince ourselves that buying that one magic notebook will solve all of our problems, but it never does. Nor does the second one, or the third, or the 10th. Well, Tiimo app is more useful than having all the notebooks in the world. And what use are notebooks if you keep losing your pen anyway? Tiimo app has hugely helped me organize my chaotic life by offering the most user-friendly interface an organizational app has to offer. The difference is, it's designed by neurodiverse brains for neurodiverse brains. And you can tell. It's built to adapt to your neurodiverse way of thinking and be flexible to your way of planning. And now it's even more simple with the AI planning assistant. Tiimo now offers an incredible new voice transcribing service, making it even easier to use. A simple voice prompt when you have to plan something or something pops into your mind, and the new AI planning assistant hears it and transcribes it instantly into an easily digestible list of instructions for you to remember. Tiimo is here to help you simplify planning, build focus, and make life happen. No more decision paralysis. The new AI planning assistant makes it so quick and easy to insert information, you can do it before you've forgotten or been distracted. Give it a go and use the link in my bio for 30% off. Just a note though, this code is only applicable on the web browser, not on the smartphone. Then, when Tiimo solves all of your problems, go ahead and use your notebooks for something useful, like propping up a wobbly table leg or mopping up a spilt coffee. Back to the episode. How important is it to allow your child to socialize with other kids? Like, how important is socializing for children?
Yeah, I think it depends on individuals. I think what is important is if we have more positive social experiences when we're young, it is logical that you're going to grow up as an adult who expects and anticipates to have more positive social experiences as an adult. I know I used to feel sometimes with friends that I had to ration myself because I think you knew that I could be a lot or that I struggled in this area. So I remember, when people used to text me when I was in my 20s saying, do you want to go to the cinema? This sounds so absurd, but I used to think, I saw you last Tuesday. You can't see me on a Tuesday and a Thursday. That's too much me, really. In a way, I do think RSD, is either partly or wholly created by these negative early experiences. And so I think if you can, speak to school and help them to try and increase the chances of those positive experiences, that's brilliant. And that may be focusing on your child socializing with other ADHDers or other autistic people, because we do have very good social skills. Often when schools talk about, improving social skills, they're talking about neurotypical social skills. And it's, very important for young people to realize you've got your own perfectly, brilliant set of social skills there. I think it can be handy actually for, neurodivergent people or ADHDers to be aware of neurotypical social preferences, so you can turn it on when you want to in the playground, but also to understand that's not how you have to socialize.
Yeah, it's the sort of the joke, isn't it, about you could ADHD kids, or certainly me, in conversation, you just constantly want to interrupt, or you get so frustrated when you sort of know the end of someone else's sentences before they're very slow talking.
Yeah,
And you'll sort of have to rein yourself in because you think, oh no, that's a neurotypical way of communicating. You have to wait patiently. But there is a balance, right? You have to be somewhere in the middle. You mentioned their neurotypical social standards. What do you think would be like a neurodivergent social interaction or a social standard for a child?
Yeah, so like if we talk about interrupting, I mean, I agree with you. I'm an interrupter, and I don't necessarily love it when people interrupt.
Yes, very angry when it's on the other foot.
Yeah, it's fine when I do it. Yeah. But I think it's just about having awareness and empathy for why we interrupt so much. And it's executive function difficulties, isn't it? Possibly combined with a quick brain and a low boredom threshold, really. And I think, if you happen to have got that conversation quite a while before someone else does, it's kind of excruciating to wait for it to get to its natural end. So I think in my experience, neurodivergent circles, there is just so much more tolerance, so if you do interrupt someone, you're like, oh shit, sorry, I'm terrible at this. There's not that holding it against you, or not the seeing you as a bad person. And I think really we equate failing with neurotypical social skills as being an inconsiderate, not good person. And I think that comes from neurotypicals. So I try to highlight with my sons that, a lot of my best friends are neurotypicals. But neurotypicals aren't all that. Some neurotypicals I find quite intolerant, of when we mess up. I've stood up so many people in my lives, and the neurodivergents who I stand up never make me feel shit about it. The neurotypicals sometimes do. And I think my experience of neurodivergent folk is that we've all got that deep empathy for messing up. So we'd never want to make someone else feel bad or shame about it.
Yeah. Why do you think neurotypicals might make you feel shitty if you sort of cancel at the last minute compared to a neurodivergent who might be more forgiving?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it does come back to understanding. And I don't think that is a fault of neurotypicals. I think it is really hard to understand until you go through it yourself. And I also don't know about you. I can find it hard to articulate some of these things. And so, burnout is often why you feel like you have to cancel at the last minute, because I feel like I'm going to have a breakdown if I, go out tonight. And but you really feel like you are going to, don't you?
You were in a good mood when you said yes to it.
Yes, exactly. I've spent the last 2 weeks dreading it, but I still love you.
Yeah.
That's complicated to explain to someone.
Well, it's like finding your tribe, right? It's
like,
in a sense, this community of like-minded people, essentially you get it. Like you get each other. And so when you cancel at the last minute, a neurotypical person might think, well, that's rude.
Yeah.
Like, how dare they cancel within 2 hours' notice? But a neurodivergent, they'll just totally understand the version that you're at now might be very anxious, very burnt out, very tired, is a completely different person to the person who said yes 2 weeks ago. Yeah. They get that. They get that. Like, we had a brilliant guest on, Judith Mooring. She described it as being very tidal, depending on whether you're high dopamine and very excited and you can say yes to events and to social events when the tide's out, but then the tide comes in and suddenly you regret saying yes and you cancel at the last minute. And if you're neurodivergent, you get that. You're on the same page. So when it does happen, again, you have a lot more empathy, a lot more understanding, because you probably do the same.
I love the title thing. I'm going to, I'm low tide at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, look, I know I'm stereotyping here, but I think sometimes with neurodivergent people, that there can be less ascribing a kind of moral value judgment on these things. So I think as a society, we can see these kind of things as evidence that someone isn't a good, thoughtful, kind friend, and that can be misleading.
Yeah, the best friends I have in my life are ones that when we have a mutual understanding. And looking back now, they are 100% neurodivergent. You can go for months, years, sometimes without seeing each other.
Yeah.
And it's not because we don't deeply care about each other. It's just because we're happily doing our own thing. We're all living in our own nows. And then occasionally we meet up. We play computer games for 5 hours, and it's genuinely like no time has passed.
Yeah,
it's the friendships that require constant maintenance and texting back and check-ins, and they're not going to work.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've noticed that my 2 neurodivergent kids, they need quite a lot of time to themselves, like we all do, I think. And so I've noticed that when they're with only children, when they're young, it's a disaster. If you've got a neurodivergent kid, don't put them on a play date with an only child, because they're used to be engaged, or a neurotypical only child, because they're used to having engagement all the time and everyone's attention solely on them. So I've noticed they find it a bit difficult if your child just needs some time alone.
On this sort of flip side of all of this, I suppose if you have a neurodivergent child and they, for whatever reason, don't socialize too much, what could someone who doesn't get socialized well, what problems could that create?
Yeah. Well, I think it is about really working out what's right for your child. So, I have spent a lot of my career trying to point out, just for example, that I don't think autistic people want to be left alone in the playground. But having said that, there are some that really do, and they should be allowed to be left alone in the playground. So I think it's like it's the same principle with an ADHD child. Is it just that they find making friends easy, but keeping it really difficult, and it's now got so painful they don't even want to try, and that's why they're opting not to socialize. And in which case, yes, it would be helpful to unpick what's going wrong. And I think if you've got brilliant support at school, wonderful. Often this is the area of schools that they don't have the time and the money and the capacity to help, neurodivergent children with. So maybe the best thing to do is try and find a sort of local neurodivergent kids for your child to hang out with, to hopefully improve the chances of success, really.
Do you think schools are good at supporting the social needs of autistic children? How does that compare to the social needs of a child who might be ADHD?
Yeah, well, so I think if I was in charge of schools, we would appreciate far more that ADHDers have their own distinct learning style. So I think often if you went through the sort of school documents and local authority documents of my son, they seem to see ADHD as a mental health issue, or they see it as in terms of behaviour. And so I've been trying to explain to them, this isn't a mental health issue. This is because his learning needs or his brain type wasn't supported initially, and then it turned into a mental health issue. So I sort of wish people would better appreciate I see it as a distinct cognitive style, a distinct style of learning. So yeah, if I was in charge of the DFE, which will never happen after the many critical things I've written about them, I would have schools for ADHDers where they could flip between tasks. They would be given a lot more sort of autonomy in how they worked. You would obviously have movement breaks, and you would have learning as much as possible linked to interests, for example, and you would have more support for the sort of the difficulties ADHDers face socially.
Those social challenges that someone with ADHD might face at a really young age in the playground, if you observe those happening For example, you literally see like an ADHD child getting super excited about a new friendship, and they're playing with each other, and then 2 days later, the ADHD child's kind of over it and feeling very lonely. Or there's been a social interaction and something's triggered the ADHD child, and RSD's happened, and that child has either raged or got internalized with sadness. Like if you observe these events and you literally witness emotional dysregulation in real time, what can you do at that juncture to support that child?
Well, let's take the RSD really. So I think naming it and talking about it, like, do teachers talk about RSD? You know, I'm sure some do, because obviously some are going to be ADHDs themselves, and there will be those that are, you know, brilliant and have read everything about it. But at the moment, largely the conversation seems to be in this community, doesn't it? And it would be fantastic to see it kind of discussed in classrooms as well. So I think if the teacher could say, you know, maybe they could do it as part of their general lesson, so it's not specific to the neurodivergent kids. And the next time just say, oh, do you think maybe that, you know, that you felt a sensitivity for this reason? And I think also like having a toolkit for when RSD strikes, like if every ADHD child to have a little box with their fidget and their lavender oil.
We already did that, even as an adult.
Exactly. You know, so to give them something to do when it happens. So maybe just before that explosion, if that child knew they could go into their classroom and have their sort of toolkit, maybe that could preempt it. But also I think just explain to that child, you know, RSD is horrible. It's horrible, but it will pass. You've been here before, you've got through it. So I think what I'm saying is giving adults the language to know how to support children during these episodes, and give the children themselves the language to know why, because you as that individual know you're having a big reaction, don't you? You know it's bigger than your friends, and you feel a bit stupid about it, don't you, or everything else. So giving that child the explanation why.
Yes,
that feels so absolutely crushing in that moment. And then afterwards, maybe you're a bit embarrassed about it a day later.
Yeah, and that's going to reduce the shame, like retrospective shame. If you have color and context to add to the experience, if you have a why, you know, that's why we do the podcast, is to add why to all of these things. And if a child has that why at that super young age, then it's going to add meaning. And with meaning, you can go a lot easier on yourself because you understand why that happened.
100%. And, you know, I try to do this quite a bit with my children is, you know, sort of talk about my failures. You know, I do that quite a bit to say, oh, I really messed up with a friend. And sometimes I invent it. So I'll say, I got so upset because I thought a friend didn't like me. And it bothered me the entire day, and I was just getting more and more and more upset. So I decided to text her and say, can I just check, did I upset you? And she texted me back and said, no, you didn't upset me. And I was like, thank God for that. So I try to either articulate those real life situations or sort of make up a few situations that will be helpful for my child. But I think modelling is really key, because I think learning about sort of social difficulties, I think doing it directly with someone, it's too awful, isn't it? Like if I said, oh, Alex, did you notice then you were interrupting that person like nobody's business? They were getting really frustrated with you. You know, that's too hurtful, isn't it? But if I said to you, Alex, gosh, I just can't stop seeming to interrupt. So I'm now trying to lessen it by writing things down. So I find it easier not to interrupt. But also when I do interrupt, I remind myself it doesn't make me a bad person. There are reasons why I interrupt, and that's okay too. So, and I just think, would it be lovely if teachers were able to do a bit more of this modelling as well, and talking about their own personal social, let's all talk about our social failings.
Yeah. You mentioned RSD a couple of times, and it's a topic that comes up on this podcast time and time again.
Yeah.
It's such a deep, complex topic, and the consensus is that it kind of, the emotional dysregulation behind it comes from many corrective messages and comments from our early years. I think 20,000 is the sort of the number that gets pushed around a lot. We're exposed to 20,000 more negative comments in our early years. Therefore, as an adult, we're primed to react defensively. But could emotional dysregulation be explained in a different way? Could it be a consequence of not being brought up correctly by parents?
Yeah. Well, firstly, how I see emotional dysregulation is it's probably a lot of things, isn't it? But I think neurodivergent ADHD people just have a whole lot more to be stressed about, and I think that is part and parcel of it. I often think that really it's quite simple. If, life is stressful for you, or if we broaden it out, if you're just a minority that's been treated badly for centuries, bad stuff happens. And I think there's that. Secondly, is it a consequence of parenting? No, nobody's perfectly calm all the time, are they? No matter how saintly the parent. So no, I don't think it is. I think, since I've been diagnosed myself, I do try to focus much more on my own regulation. So I found it a helpful process just to make decisions that are going to mean I'm stressed out a lot. Because in the process of my assessment, people ask you, how anxious are you? And I'm like, well, I'm anxious all the time. I find it very hard to tell you a time when I'm not anxious. And so, they're like, okay, that's chronic anxiety. And then you're like, oh, I've never heard it being mentioned that way. And then you sort of think, okay, well, how am I going to change my life so I'm less anxious?
What are you anxious about?
I think it has been suggested to me that I'm anxious because I'm overcompensating the whole time. I think I'm masking the whole time. And I think that is a source. I always just thought I was very anxious. So in a way, it's been like, I get to 48 and this is why. It's not just innate in me. It's because some overcompensation process.
Do you think people with ADHD are in a state of anxiety, heightened arousal, in an anxious state because we're also quite primed? We're always alert to potential danger, potential threats, potential criticisms.
Yeah.
So our inner child is constantly alert to risk, and the effort to hide that is the mask you referred to.
Yeah, I think there is something in that. I don't think the world, is as a friendly place, really, is it? And, I look at pictures of myself when I was young, and I look removed, actually, I sometimes think. So you've got a group, and then there's me on the outside. And I think sometimes I look at that as inattentive ADHD. I think I was somewhere else in my head the whole time, really. But I also think I've just got a certain look, and I recognize that look sometimes in other younger neurodivergent people. And that look is, I guess, stress and a slightly hostile sensory environment, and just finding things 25% more difficult than other people.
How important is it, do you think, for the developing child to receive love? And that might sound like an obvious question. Obviously, it's important. But if that child doesn't get the love that it needs because that child's behavior is out of the ordinary that the parents expect, therefore don't give it the love that it might get if its behavior was more in line with the standards that the parents expected. If there is that gap there, what effect can it have on that child if it doesn't receive the love that it needs?
I really feel like as parents, we should try and be the shield. So you've got society's expectations, which are based on a set of rules, many of which are illogical, that work for neurotypical people. And then you've got your family who, sometimes are going to find it difficult to follow those rules, or actually it's just going to stress them right out. So I think really as parents, if we can try and be that shield to show your child, actually, you don't have to follow everyone else's rules, and it's fine to ignore that person, whatever they think. So I was once at a parenting course, and there was a guy who had taken his child to the Bubble Museum, which is quite a horrific experience if you're a neurodivergent, I can confirm. And his ADHD son was probably completely overstimulated, lots of noise, and had a really spectacular meltdown. And he said that, people were tut-tutting. He said the security guard was looming into focus, was just about to sort of take over. And he said he just had this moment, and I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but
Yes,
I found it very helpful. He just had this moment of fuck you to everyone else. Like, you're not going to have to be at home picking up the pieces. So fuck you and your views. It doesn't matter. And so what he did is he said to the security guard, basically, back off. I know how to deal with this. And he let his tantruming meltdown child just kind of go a bit berserk and run out of steam and let it run its course. Because, he knew that if he'd intervened and done the performative telling off that, everyone else seems to want you to do, that would only extend the child's meltdown. It wasn't going to help them. It wasn't going to help the child. And I found that story oh, yes. So now I've got that little voice in my head, fuck you. And I don't mean it aggressively. I just mean it as code, is I don't have to let you get in my head, strangers, and I'm just going to focus on what my child needs and not what other people think.
Brilliant. It's almost like a slogan. If I get merchandise done, that's for all parents everywhere.
Yeah. And I mean, slightly linked to that is that you and I talked a bit about this before. I'm not great at strict parenting because I lack the consistency, but also I'm not totally sure that strict parenting old school approach works with ADHD kids. What I favour is a approach based on collaboration, good communication, and being the shield really, and really understanding someone. So I think to love someone, somebody once told me, is to take the effort to really understand them. And I think as parents, sometimes we think we can understand someone because we spend all our time with them. But, is that always true? And especially if you've got a child with an invisible disability like ADHD, is that enough just to physically be present? Do you really understand precisely what's going on with them? So I learnt this lesson the hard way because I had a 9-year-old who I just thought was bulletproof. I thought he was confident. I thought yes, I am a good parent after all because I've created this confident child. He was, the class clown. He's hilarious. But actually, we realised he wasn't confident. He was using humour as an effort to try and lessen, sort of negative interactions in school. And the school didn't properly understand them. I didn't properly understand them, so it's not the school's fault. None of us did really. And he was not meeting behaviour expectations in the school. He found it really hard to understand the learning because his focus was just so tricky for him. And I think, if teachers really understood what it's like for ADHD people to have to wrestle with your brain to try and focus on something when you're finding it hard to. It's so exhausting, isn't it? And so hard. And so you're struck doing that and losing a lot of the time. But because in a way, his ADHD anxiety didn't look like neurotypical anxiety, nobody picked it up really.
Do you think to avoid a situation like that, or to at least limit the effect, it would be helpful if the school had a better dialogue with the parents? In other words, the parents almost put together a written profile of how the child was presenting at home. Yeah. And then the teacher could do similar to how the child was presenting at school. And then you would be quite easy to sort of compare those two to see how big a gap there was, how big the mask was compared to how the child was at home to how it is at school. And if there is a really wide difference and the mask is really thick, then that would be a signal to maybe intervene at that stage.
Yeah. I mean, you're totally right. The bigger the mask, the bigger the difference in who you really are and who you're coming across as at school, the bigger your problem really as a parent and the bigger mental health problems really that child is facing. But yeah, I mean, we do that, parents and schools, to a certain extent. I mean, it depends on the school's attitude. It depends on teachers' capacity. The big problem is teachers don't really have time to do enough of it. And I'm sure enough, as much as they would like. And I found it a bit difficult because, as a parent, you can't go into school really to see how your child really is. But I think it would wouldn't it be fantastic if your child was diagnosed as ADHD and somebody who's an ADHD professional went into school for every child diagnosed and just could spot all this stuff going on and speak to the teacher about it, and the teacher had the time to sort of adapt things.
I had a brilliant guest on, a lady called Sarah Templeton, and she said a little hack for parenting ADHD kids is to put them in the driver's seat. And what I mean by that, she used the example of, say, rather than saying dinner is at 7 p.m, you would say, right, do you want dinner at 7 p.m. or 7:05? It doesn't really make a tangible difference to your schedule, but it puts them in the driver's seat, and it's less likely to create a tantrum because they feel like they're in control.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that is the collaboration aspect to it. I absolutely do. So in our household, I mean, my youngest son is demand avoidant, which comes with a whole host of problems with learning. But one good strategy with that is it's called low demand parenting. So, I would not, on a good day, I wouldn't say to my son, put your shoes on. I would say the shoes are by the front door. But I think if my grandmother came into my home, she would be horrified because basically in our home, there isn't that same hierarchy between adults and children. But I do find it helpful because I think, if there is a situation with your child and something's happening which is an undesirable outcome, I sort of think the problem isn't your child, the problem is the problem. And I think what you want to do is you want it to be you and the child versus the problem. And so I think really in a spirit of collaboration and brainstorming, this is, this situation's happening, it's really not great for you. The teacher doesn't love it either. What can we do to make it easier for you? And I think also on that respect as well, I think, being in your child's camp when it comes to school is really important. So I think often, with parents, we're all raised to agree with teachers in the school. And, I really love teachers, and especially in my son's school, they've been totally amazing. But at the same time, I interviewed a lot of ADHD adults for my book, and they say the only thing that got them through school was some of the teachers who had poor opinions of them. Their parents were clear that they thought that was nonsense. So I think it's really, important to show your child you're on their team. And if there is a problem with school, it's you and them figuring it out. It's not you in school, sort of on the same side and your child on the other side.
I had a guest on, Janine Perryman, who bought her ADHD daughter a teddy bear, and embroidered on the chest of the teddy bear, it said, never too much. On the one hand, it was to remind the child that she was not too much, but on the other hand, it was to say, whatever you want to come to me with, any problems that you're facing, nothing's too much. And she said that really strengthened the bond. Because obviously, I guess sometimes behaviour will have to be corrected. And I guess the question is, how do you correct behaviour without making the child feel, to reinforce that perhaps feeling of being broken? And an example is, say you're in a restaurant and the child is throwing food around, and it's a busy restaurant and food's getting everywhere. Could you frame it through the lens of consequence? In other words, rather than saying, stop throwing food around, which is very, you're just shutting it down, could you say, if you continue to throw your food around, you're going to mess up that lady's pretty dress? So you're putting it through the lens of consequence rather than just shutting down?
Yeah. I mean, some people talk about natural consequences, don't they? If you're going to throw food around, somebody in the restaurant's going to come and shout at you. That's how life works. And I think it is important that we're raising people that have to live in a community, and they have to acknowledge and respond to other people's needs. It's not all about your ADHD child's needs. But in terms of consequences, yes. I mean, if my child threw food in a restaurant, I'd be horrified and shocked. But I might try and hide it the first time and say to them, you just can't do that in a restaurant. You could, as you say, that food could hit someone's dress and they'll get really upset with you, and we don't want that. And then if they did carry on, I'd have quite a proper conversation. You know, I'd be unhappy with them about it. But I think it is, you know, I think really you want your child to come to you to talk things through. I feel like raising happy neurodivergent children is, yes, giving them a core belief that who they are is a good person, but also like identifying the things that are difficult in life and coming up with practical solutions. And I think, you know, you really want to be part of that process with your child. And I think if you're telling your child off a lot, they're not going to make you part of that process. So sometimes if my child, I mean, it doesn't happen as much as I'd like, but if my child did come to me and said, this thing happened, it was awful, and they may be talking to you about something that they're a bit ashamed about of their own behaviour, sometimes I think, well, what am I going to prioritise in this conversation? Am I going to prioritise that I want them to keep coming to me to have these difficult conversations? Or am I going to prioritising rectifying, to use an old-fashioned term, their behaviour? And often I'm going to go for the former. And then after they've come to me, you know, I might have one of those situations where I say, oh, one day I did this, and it's actually about their situation, but I'm talking about it mine, and the other person got really upset with me, and I decided I wasn't going to do it again. So I might try and deal with it in an indirect way later, and in that moment, I might prioritize the collaborative approach. And then if the indirect approach doesn't work, potentially I might be more direct with them, but I might not do it in that moment when they're tentatively telling you something that maybe is something they're a bit embarrassed about.
You've written a book about nurturing ADHD children and another book about nurturing autistic children. But what about nurturing a child that might be AuDHD? Is there a difference there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one difference is that, you know, sometimes those kids don't get identified because, you know, I'm sure you've discussed this loads, the two brain types can sort of camouflage each other. I mean, my personal view is that, you know, the people that I felt were most up to date in this area and that I respected, their view was that, you know, between 50 and 75% of us are both. So I think I'm coming to the conclusion that the majority of us are both autistic and ADHD. And I think if we can fast forward into the future, I would be interested to see if we just talk about ourselves being neurodivergent. Because at the moment, you know, there are some autism specialist schools. I mean, there are no, as far as I know, ADHD specialist school. Do you know about them, Alex?
No, I don't.
I mean, and why is that? That makes me quite upset, really. And I think that shows you actually the lack of kind of approach, really, and thought about ADHD kids in the education system. But anyway, putting that aside, having a school for autistic children where, let's say, half or 3/4 are going to be ADHD too, it's like kind of a nonsense not to have both strategies for both brain types covered. So I sort of feel like in the future, maybe we'll all be all AuDHD, and it won't even be called AuDHD, which is quite fiddly to say. It will be called neurodivergent.
Yeah, keep it simple. If someone's listening to this and they're sort of new to this whole conversation, and they've got a child and they suspect that their child isn't neurotypical, but they are witnessing some behavior that they can't explain, what do you think is, if we just focus on ADHD, what might be some classic traits, behaviors of a child that might indicate ADHD?
Yeah. So ADHD is just the worst description, or not the worst, I'm sure there are worse, but it's a bad description for what ADHD is because, you know, it's not a deficit of attention. It's inconsistent and unreliable attention. You know, 20% of young people are not hyperactive, and they tend to be the girls who are daydreamy, fidgety brain rather than fidgety body. They're the ones that are going to be described as being away with the fairies, scatty, all those kind of words. And, you know, and actually once, you know, according to Dr. William Dodson, you know, when I interviewed him, he said, like, once you're past the age of 15, no matter your gender, you tend not to be so hyperactive anyway, because, you know, you've learnt that you annoy neurotypical. So you're trying to put that on the down low, really. So really, I think the things that I think are more accurate to look for is mental hyperactivity rather than physical hyperactivity. That seems to me the absolute consistent. You know, is your child really struggling to organise themselves? But really, organisation doesn't do it justice, does it, as a descriptor? Because really, we're talking about so many things. We're talking about difficulty doing your teeth, getting dressed, staying on task. You know, these boring tasks just feel heavy, don't they? Like there's a barrier and it's difficult to do them, you know, not interrupting. All these things come under the umbrella of so-called organisational tasks. So there's that. And then there's the kind of like, you know, my son does chat an awful lot. So that's, I think, a reflection of the mental hyperactivity. But what is the consequence of the mental hyperactivity? Is it the overthinking, the sort of brain not being able to go to sleep because your child's brain is just whirring around? You know, I dislike being on my own. I used to think I hated going for walks. But now I know myself better. I realise if I've got, you know, earpods and a podcast, I really enjoy it. It's just I need that stimulation of someone else. So I think, you know, the kind of, the inconsistent focus, I think, is a real giveaway. Is your child like totally engrossed in something if they're interested in it and really struggling to focus if they're bored by it?
And taking all of that into account, how might an ADHD child react if they feel like they're misunderstood?
Yeah. Well, it's not a great place to be, is it? I think you just feel, I think you feel lonely, I think, really. And I think also, to go back to my sort of cosmically cursed assumption about my childhood, I think it's part of that, because I think you feel like something's only happening to you, you know, and I think maybe that's why getting kids identified earlier on is so helpful, is to learn. You know, I found the idea of being cursed, it was horrible. It's like, what have I done to deserve this? You know, it's very unhelpful. And I tended to idealize other people, think, oh my God, you know, they seem to have life down. Like they can do all these amazing things. Why am I so shit at life? And then I think you start to see a more nuanced picture. Yes, I do struggle with all these things, but actually those neurotypical people, they also do struggle with things a bit more than I realised too. I don't think life is plain sailing for them either. I think we can romanticize how easy life is for you if you're not ADHD or autistic, but I'm not sure the reality totally matches up to it. So I think it can give you a more realistic picture.
And generationally, you know, autism and ADHD is very much spoken about now, taken very seriously, but there's a whole generation of people that are adults now that when they were younger, that when they were kids experiencing what we're talking about, the conversation wasn't happening. It wasn't taken seriously. They weren't heard. They weren't understood. In fact, they were very much misunderstood. What are the consequences, do you think, of a whole lifetime of being misunderstood? How does that present as an adult?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think it depends, but I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, what I know is that, you know how people like to talk about severe and not severe ADHD and functioning labels. You know, among the interviews I've done, sometimes it's the people that would be perceived as being the highest functioning people that I really worry about, and they're actually the interviews that affect me the most, because I feel so sad for them, really. So I think basically there's been a historic misunderstanding, and it goes on today, that if you do a better impression of a neurotypical, you're less affected by your ADHD, and that is just plain wrong. So it could be that that person is dedicating all their energy into appearing someone else, and as we've discussed, that comes at a price, really, for your happiness and your functioning outside of those kind of interactions. But one thing that has occurred to me recently is, you know, we're in the throes of this discussion about ADHD being grossly overdiagnosed or overdiagnosed. despite, as far as I'm aware, any real concrete evidence that that's true. And in fact, I think we would both agree that actually the evidence is pointing to it being underdiagnosed, not over. But I've recently written about sort of issues around parenting and neurodivergent children. And I've noticed that kind of below the line comments from older people tend to say, well, my grown-up daughter would no doubt be diagnosed as autistic now, but she's fine. You know, the implication being that, you know, she didn't need a diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think's going on is that possibly their grown-up daughter isn't fine, and possibly life was more difficult for her than it needed to be. And those parents don't want to face up to their guilt for not having not having identified that daughter sooner. And like, it probably wasn't a thing back then. There was probably no opportunity for them to be identified. But what I think is interesting is part of this backlash from older parents who didn't have the opportunity to identify their child's sort of differences, and that I think when you're forced into that situation, that can come with quite significant levels of guilt, or you have to tie yourself in knots not to face up to what complicated feelings that might arise in you. And I think, you know, obviously I would say this, but, you know, saying, okay, my grown-up child didn't benefit from early identification and support, therefore no one should, which I think is what some people are saying is no way, no argument. You know, it's an understand emotional response potentially for some parents, but, you know, we don't just carry on screwing up neurodivergent people for fairness.
You could be a parent who now has an understanding of neurodivergent conditions. You have a child who is on many metrics successful, but that's possibly because they are so overcompensating, and the comorbidities that come with that is high stress, high anxiety, addiction issues. And then the parent, almost like you said, doesn't want to face the reality of the fact that they should have spotted it sooner. And then do you think there's a potential to just go into complete denial at that stage?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have been that parent. I don't know if this helps, but I wrote How to Raise a Happy Autistic Child. The book did well. And so I was, in theory, the expert on, you know, autistic children. And should you know about ADHD, I then took on a very kind of big job at a newspaper. And my 9-year-old wasn't doing really well, but I didn't have the time to engage with it or spot it or do anything about it. So actually my 9-year-old, you know, suffered burnout. And, you know, even that word doesn't do justice for what's happened in the last year. So I guess I don't know if this helps people, but, you know, I'd written a book on how to help your child be happy and get them the appropriate support. And I completely failed at doing that. And that process of having to face up to that was intensely painful, and I felt really guilty. And so it's not a pleasant process, but it's not as bad as letting the situation continue. You know, if you've got a child and there are problems there, they don't tend to go away, you know. So I think, you know, facing your own guilt and shortcomings can be very necessary and very helpful. And you can come out the other side a lot better parent for it. So I had to go back to the drawing board. I mean, I somewhat arrogantly thought I knew a lot because of my first book, but then I realized through this quite brutal process of my second child's kind of falling out of school that I didn't. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I had to start going back to those parenting groups that I hated going to. And I had to listen, and I had to learn, and I had to stop assuming I knew about my son because I'm his mum. And of course I do. You know, we don't always really. And I think, you know, being open-minded really, and also being prepared to learn about your own child and prepared to take on board what other people are telling you about your own child.
If someone's listening and they were one of those children that were missed and misunderstood, and they're now in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're finally realizing now that they were missed.
Yeah.
How important is it for someone like that to heal their inner child?
Yeah, I guess I'm quite interested because think I might be going through that a bit myself, because I'd been identified at the age of 48, with both. I think I found it really helpful because I have been able to talk to my children about modifying my life and what I'm learning to, in the hope that they will learn. Actually, putting yourself in an unsuitable environment doesn't work. You've got to pick your environments, and that may mean making tough decisions. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this is directly answering your questions, but a very logical neurodivergent said to me, okay, if you were identified when you were at school, what would have happened? And I thought about it and I was like, absolutely nothing. So, if we're talking about me, would I want to go back in time at my very strict school and get an identification as autistic ADHD? Would it have helped me back in the late 70s and 80s? I don't know if it would have. I just would have been given, this is your deficits, this is what you can't do. I ended up having a good career, so much so that my old school, where I was miserable at, I've learned, because I worked at the Times, they now do me in the, when people go to open days, because I worked at the Times and Sunday Times, being the middle class dream. Now, the school in the slideshow to prospective parents, I'm on there.
Yeah, very proud of you.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like almost spitefully telling them to take me off there because I was so deeply unhappy at the school.
Right.
But my point being is, no, being identified for me wouldn't practically have made a huge amount of difference. But at the same time, me going easier on myself, learning about my own emotional regulation difficulties is definitely helpful as a parent, because I want my children to be calmer. So therefore, I have to be calm in the first place. And to be calm, I have to make different decisions and not be in a very busy open plan newsroom that's sensorially very tricky to navigate. And, I have to work out how I can best operate.
Do you think with awareness of these neurodivergent conditions gives you an understanding or reinforces the belief that parenting could be cyclical? In other words, the way you tend to treat your children might be the way that you were treated by your parents. And given the fact that neurodivergent conditions are generally genetic, you could break the cycle with that knowledge?
So are you saying, like, for example, a lot of people, my peers, are trying not to parent the way they were parented.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So we're kind of, sort of lurching from one to the other, maybe. And if there's an opportunity to break the cycle because you're doing parenting that's appropriate to that individual rather than the trend of the day. Yes, I think that is possible. I think, I guess in these kind of, what some people might perceive as these overly permissive parenting days, that could benefit a section of neurodivergent society, and maybe the slightly stricter parenting, it could be argued, could benefit another one. So I'm sure the answer is more complicated. But I think tolerance to difference is what's going to make a big difference to neurodivergent kids. I think, hopefully that's going to happen and is here to stay more, despite this current sort of conversation around ADHD not being real or exaggerated, or we're all making it up. But I just one thing, Alex, because I feel like we're running out of time and I haven't really talked about it, and I should. And I know it's one of your things that you've been doing great work on, but, ADHD girls are not being identified in school. I don't think there is like a good level of understanding within schools of what we called inattentive ADHD, which is female ADHD, let's say. And that is that girl might not appear hyperactive, but they may be more daydreamy and, sort of like me, being somewhere else mentally rather than in the room. And I think what I struggle with as an adult is if I, risk telling someone I've got ADHD, I know I'm not what they think about ADHD because they don't know about female ADHD. And in fact, do they know about ADHD in great detail anyway? But it's such a bonkers process where I have to say, I have this thing. I know you don't know that I have this thing because what you think about ADHD isn't my ADHD, but my ADHD is real. So you get into this really awkward conversation where it's slightly defensive. You have to teach people about inattentive ADHD at the same time. Even as an adult, I find that quite difficult. So I'm wondering, what is that like for children? You know, like the mum says, you know, to the teacher, she's got ADHD. The teacher's like, oh, really? You know, it takes them by surprise because once again, this kind of type of ADHD isn't well understood. And, you know, just that process of disbelief is kind of, you know, that the child is going to sense that and know it. And it does really leave you feeling a bit of a fraud, like you're making up your difficulties. You're not, you know, you're not allowed to have allowances because you feel like you should cope. And so I just sort of think we need to teach the teachers about inattentive ADHD.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the biggest myths, right? It's like only boys can have ADHD. Only you have to be physically hyperactive to have ADHD. ADHD doesn't exist. People with ADHD don't work hard enough. These are all myths that you know, people like you and me are working so hard to debunk. And it is disheartening if a teacher still believes that foundational myth that only boys can have ADHD. Or if you have got those, I describe it as those internalized, highly caffeinated squirrels, that racing mind that does not stop sometimes. And it can create huge overwhelm, huge overstimulation, anxiety, physically very still.
Yeah.
In stark contrast to the idea that many people still have of ADHD, that you must be bouncing around the room and running around and throwing chairs all over the place. You know, to have these conversations is fundamentally important. So when a parent goes to speak to the teacher, or the teacher just observes a girl in the classroom who is physically still but might be very quiet, then at least they have some foundational knowledge to have that conversation.
I definitely think so. And I don't know if this is a helpful way, but I think sometimes like when you can start spotting inattentive ADHD, you can spot a mile off, can't you? It is a certain look and it is that person being zoned out, essentially, isn't it? But I think until you've developed that skill to spot someone is zoned out, you don't notice it because I think we have spent our entire lives trying to hide how zoned out we are. But actually, it's there and we can spot it in each other. And I think if you can sort of, as a parent, say to the teacher, look, I know I totally get why it might be hard for you to see at the moment, but can you keep an eye on her this week? And can you look specifically at her to see if you think she's looking zoned out? Because I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to get that teacher in the habit of spotting when their child is zoned out. And hopefully the child will come back and say, gosh, yeah, now I get what you're saying. She is zoned out a lot. And then maybe you could say to the teacher, you know, what would be wonderful is if you could say to my daughter, like give her lots of opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Because at the moment, teachers are often like, I've told you once, and that's all I'm going to, you know, I'm not going to repeat myself because you should listen and you should, but really that's setting up ADHD is to fail. They need the opportunity. That's not realistic. They need to be able to, the information to be repeated. So you could say to the teacher, can you give those opportunities for my daughter to understand, you know, or be repeated the task? And also what would be amazing is if you could say to my daughter, look, if you didn't get the information the first time, that is totally fine. I sometimes, you know, miss information and I find myself sort of zoning out as well, just to make that person in the classroom feel like it's less a failing on their part.
So fascinating. Jessie, this has been truly fascinating. I want to ask you one final question before we move on to your item.
Yes.
It's actually quite a big question to end with, but what are the staple ingredients to successfully bringing up a neurodivergent child?
It is, tolerating difference. There's no right way to parent. It's about treating your child as an individual. I think it's coming up with those practical solutions to life's problems. I think it is about, you know, collaborating with your child, I'm on your team. Let's figure this out together. And I think it is about, it's about getting the support right at school. And if that means being that parent at school, be that parent. I think it's about being always polite, but also insistent. If there's a problem and there's a problem, don't sort of let yourself persuade yourself otherwise, because it's easier for you not to face up to it. So yeah, and also your own trying to manage your own sort of state so you're not frazzled and dysregulated yourself trying to
super useful. You better to kick up a fuss for the sake of your child and others, really. If you make that point firmly, then you're going to be boosting the education generally within that school.
And also, I think we absolutely rightly feel sorry for teachers, and we do, and we should. Everything's being lumped on them, but the problem is we can't feel so sorry for them that we can't ask them to do the things that we need, the key things for our child, because then your child, can lose out. So really, just with your school, prioritize what are the things that are going to make the big difference, and just keep talking to school until those things happen.
Very useful. Thank you, Jessie. I've been incredibly excited to reveal your ADHD item, which I know what it is, so I'm laughing. I'm excited to hear your explanation. It's hiding underneath this cloth. I'm going to reveal it now. Right, I'm going to pass that to you and I'll let you explain what it is.
I feel, firstly, I should apologise because this is going to go onto your shelf and really lower the tone.
No, it's perfect. No, do explain.
This is my IKEA chopping board. And what the story is that it tells is that I leave things on hot hobs regularly. So what I do is I forget to turn the hob off because I'm inattentive and forget about that detail. And then I put the chopping board on the hot hob. And then I go away and I'm like, oh, what's that smell? And it's that, acrid plastic smell. Yeah. And then there's like, Mum, you've done it again. And then that is the result. And I do this like once a week. I burn tea towels once a week because I put them on the hob. We've got like it's not induction, but it's,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so I leave tea towels on them and then suddenly there's the smell and I can see them turning black and they're about to smoke. So I have to throw them into our garden. And we've got a lodger and she, poor woman, is actually one of her big phobias is fires in the house. So I terrify her regularly. But that's me.
So hilarious. Very relatable as well. I wonder if there was a correlation between like minor house fires and ADHD.
Oh God, our insurance premiums are bad enough.
Yeah, I have an air fryer. And do you have an air fryer?
Yeah, I do.
And I always forget to clean the air fryer, so I use it again. And there's often oil and fat from the previous use. So I put it on, 10 minutes later, smoke is just pouring out of it. Run over, turn it off. But yeah, good reminder of some of our quirks. Penultimately, Jessie, I want to do the ADHD Agony aunt section. It's called the washing machine of woes because my item is a washing machine because I leave my clothes in the washing machine after the cycle. And I do ask everyone, do you do that?
I absolutely do that.
Yes.
Yeah. How many times have you had to redo?
Oh, my record is 7. 7, like, shit, I forgot, damp, restart it. I think I've gone through half a bottle of like the detergent liquid on one cycle before. But I have been using the Tiimo app, which is the sponsor of the show, and they do a good job at reminding me. But this week in the washing machine of woes, Jessie, if I can get it out. This week in the washing machine of woes, my child is very shy and having trouble socializing, but a friend of mine who is a doctor says it could be ADHD. She's only 10, but these don't seem to be the common ADHD traits. How can this be?
Well, I mean, it could be that what you associate as ADHD is quite misleading, as we discussed. So my son used to sit down and draw when he was younger, and I thought, well, he can't have ADHD. And yeah, now I know absolutely he had ADHD. That was his special interest, really. So, I mean, read up about ADHD. Obviously you're watching this podcast, so that's an excellent start. And, I obviously would say my book's got some good information, but I think, maybe sort of following social media accounts from ADHDers And you could ask them questions about how they were when they're young, or run past, some of the things you observe about your child. You could keep a diary, really, couldn't you? And look at them for a week and just observe what their strengths and challenges are, see if you can draw patterns. And then, but also I think, worry about whether they're ADHD later, just get them on a waiting list, because I spent ages agonizing, this exhausting back and forth. Is my son ADHD? Isn't he? And actually, why should I bloody know? I'm not a doctor.
Exactly.
So you wouldn't, if you had a bad leg, you wouldn't think, oh God, is it my leg, or is it something else that's causing it? You just phone up the GP, wouldn't you? But I think because we've got this kind of whole overdiagnosis narrative, it's all got into our heads. So basically, just get them on a waiting list and then agonize whether they are or aren't while you wait the 2 or 3 years, or, even privately is a bit of a wait now.
Yeah. Brilliant advice, Jessie. Thank you so much. And just finally, I want to deliver to you the letter written by the previous guest. Every week, my guests write 3 rules to live by, and they put it in that post office down there, and I deliver previous guest's letter to you. And if you could kindly read out their 3 rules to live by.
I feel like I can't believe I'm here opening this envelope because I've seen it. 3 rules to live by. Do what you love. Guard your health fiercely. Caffeine and nicotine are massively underrated as causes of anxiety and insomnia.
How many coffees do you drink a day?
I don't drink coffee, but I drink shitloads of tea.
Okay. How many cups a day?
It can be up to like 10 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like just herbal or like normal? No, normal.
I hate herbal tea. I'm offended by it. But brilliant rules. I love the first 2. Yeah, probably true about 3, but I don't want to lose it quite yet.
Jessie, truly fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.